this evening's event obviously focuses on leavers and the perspective of people who wanted to leave the European Union. This is extremely timely, coming on the back of the historic day yesterday when the UK formally gave its notification of its intention to withdraw from the European Union under Article 50 of the treaties. There were many different motivations for people wanting to leave the European Union. If any of you have read some of the accounts of the campaigns and the very fierce infighting between the Vote Leave camp and the Leave.eu camp and their very different perspectives of issues that they wanted to emphasize, it's very clear that there were some stark differences. But across the political spectrum, there were people from all sides who took the same view on this crucial issue of whether the UK should remain a member of the European Union. And that variety of perspectives is represented in the panel tonight, where we have people from 3 different political parties and also from business here to discuss their perspectives on how they think the government has approached the process of leaving the European Union, Theresa May and her government's vision for the future, and whether that fits with their motivations and their ideas for where Britain should move forward as it leaves the EU. So immediately on my left is Theresa Villiers, who many of you will know. She was one of the members of the cabinet who campaigned to leave the EU. She was Northern Ireland Secretary from 2012 to 2016. She's been MP for Chipping Barnet since 2005 and an MEP before that. Yep. So lots of experience both in Westminster and in Brussels and Strasbourg. Next to her is Tim Martin, who is the founder and chairman of Wetherspoons, the chain of pubs, which many of you, I'm sure, will have visited at some stage, which I'm sure Tim appreciates. Recognise a few familiar punters. Mm-hmm. Next to Tim is Kelvin Hopkins, who's a Labour MP for Luton North since 1997, who also campaigned to leave the EU as part of the Labour Leave group. And after we were chatting beforehand, told me that he had similarly campaigned in 1975 to leave. So he's a Eurosceptic of long standing. And next to Kelvin is Gerard Batten, who is UKIP's Brexit spokesperson and a member of the European Parliament since 2005. Is that right? So I'd like to start with Theresa Villiers. There was some discussion over the summer in those moments after David Cameron resigned about whether somebody who supported Remain could give voice to the Brexit vision and lead the country at this next stage. And Theresa May has certainly managed to become the authentic owner of Brexit in that sense. Do you feel that the direction the government's taken matches the vision that Vote Leave had?
I do. I think the Prime Minister is taking immensely seriously implementing the result of the referendum and also making a success of the decision that this country made on the 23rd of June. And although obviously today we're reflecting on the motivations of Leave supporters, I'm sure everyone on the panel will agree with me that we fully appreciate the importance of trying to bridge the divisions which were revealed by the referendum. I think I'm absolutely passionate in support of implementing the result of the referendum and seizing the opportunities that Brexit will give us as a country, but I believe that doesn't mean disregarding the views of the 48%. I think making a success of Brexit is going to involve some compromises as we shape a new relationship with our European neighbours. And so our goal should be to create a settlement with which the majority of Leave and the majority of Remain voters can be comfortable. And I very much welcome the blueprint for departure set out in the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech and the White Paper. Now it's very difficult to see into the minds of Leave voters, as we're essentially being asked to do, but I feel that sort of at the heart of why people voted Leave was because they wanted more control over our laws, our money and our borders. Regaining control over our laws means leaving the single market. Single market membership would involve accepting the laws of the single market, which is almost all of the EU's laws. It would leave us subject to the jurisdiction of the ECJ. And as EU leaders have made clear, it would also mean accepting full freedom of movement. In my view, I think the government has a mandate and an obligation to reform our immigration system so that freedom of movement comes to an end in its current form I would expect, actually, the goal of introducing a fairer and more managed system of migration would command the support of a majority in this country, whichever side of the referendum they voted. And of course, I would emphasise that migration from Europe could and should and will continue. But the referendum result sends a clear message that net migration needs to come down to much more sustainable levels, and that we need to reassert democratic accountability and control in relation to the overall numbers. And turning to that third aspect, money, we may want to take part in certain programmes into the future run by the EU, such as Horizon 2020, and obviously that will probably require us to make a degree of financial contribution to those. It's even possible that as part of a sensible final deal with the EU, we might even consider some kind of departure payment, though I think the legal position is that we're certainly not obliged to make any such payment. But it's clear we need to bring to an end the open-ended liability to contribute several £billion every year to the EU budget. And what we save, I believe we can devote to our own priorities, including, of course, the NHS. And whilst we cannot yet be certain of what the overall consequences of Brexit will be, the early signs are positive. The disasters feared by many Remain supporters, thankfully, have not materialised, and the economy's performed strongly. The task ahead won't be easy for our Brexit negotiating team, but no one benefits from a trade war. The interests of both sides are in the forthcoming negotiation are in favour of reaching a deal between us which maximises the opportunity for cross-border trade in goods and services. So I'm sure there'll be a good debate on what caused people in this country to vote to leave in defiance of the advice of the Prime Minister, the political parties, the trade unions, the business establishment, almost all economists, and a long list of foreign leaders. And there has been something of a campaign in certain quarters to portray Leave voters as narrow-minded, or worse. Yesterday I was called, I believe, rabid by Paddy Ashdown, but I don't believe that the decision to leave the EU is symptomatic of an inward-looking or Little Englander mentality. For me, democracy was what the referendum was about. Until we leave the EU, it doesn't matter who we vote for in an election. There are many things we can't change because EU membership means vesting supreme lawmaking power in people we do not elect and cannot remove. And I believe that we can look forward to a bright future as a self-governing nation outside the European Union.
Thanks very much. And just a couple of quick points. You mentioned, obviously, the possibility of a departure payment, but that one wasn't legally obliged as part of the process of leaving.
Yep.
Do you think that's a position that many of your Conservative Party colleagues, particularly those who were strong supporters of leave, are comfortable with the concept of some sort of minimal payment, regardless of the legality of it, but as a method of achieving a settlement which they feel would be beneficial in the long term?
Well, I can't speak for all of them, and actually this isn't an issue I've discussed in detail with many of them, but my feeling is if we're going to compromise, then compromise on money, particularly if it's only a short-term sort of obligation for maybe to the end of the multi-annual financial framework. That's something that's somewhat easier to compromise on some of the other issues. It's much more important, for example, to make sure that we're free of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice than it is to ensure that we, completely stop all payments to the EU immediately after we leave.
Okay, thank you very much. Tim, if I could turn to you now. Theresa mentioned attitudes to immigration, and in fact that there's both a mandate and obligation to end freedom of movement as it currently stands, and that's a position which would have majority support. Now, you're on the record as being very positive about the benefits of immigration, particularly EU immigration. To what extent are you comfortable with a model of Brexit which impairs your ability as a businessman to recruit people from different parts of the EU?
I think when people think about business and immigration, that they're thinking, can you get someone to work on the bar on Saturday night? But I think it's a much broader issue than that. And if you look at successful economies around the world, if you look at North America, if you look at New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, they tend to have gradually rising populations. And a big issue in this country 15, 20 years ago was the fact that with a low birth rate, the economy was in the process of being about to decline. So I think there's a good economic case to be made for immigration, but the main thing is it has to be controlled by the government in a sensible way. I think what rubbed the country up the wrong way about immigration within the EU is it appeared that unelected apparatchiks, which is a slight provocative way of putting it, were deciding that whole countries could come into, migrate to the UK if they wanted to. And that didn't feel, whatever one thinks about it on a personal level, that didn't feel like a sensible or sustainable policy, particularly since in the future, unknown further countries could theoretically be allowed to come here. That's nothing against those people. But pro-immigration, I'm not so concerned about can I get someone to work in the pubs in Penzance or Wick next week, but more what is a sensible economic basis for the future prosperity of the country.
And more broadly on how the government's approach Brexit, what do you see then as the principal benefits, if it's not specifically related to controlling immigration or reducing immigration necessarily?
Well, it is related to controlling it, yes, but I take your point, yeah.
Well, not reducing it then, but controlling it.
Not necessarily reducing it, yeah.
Okay, but then what do you see as the chief benefits of leaving then from a business perspective?
I think that if you look around the world, the key feature of economic success and the freedom of people is democracy. Democracy equals prosperity and freedom. And you can see it, I mean, preaching to the converted in many ways, but look at the performance of North Korea versus South Korea. One democratic, one not. Look at the performance of West Germany versus East. And look at Japan when it became a democracy. In a few decades, it became one of the most, the second biggest economy in the world. So the principal benefits of leaving are that we're restoring democracy. I really couldn't believe, and I said it right throughout the campaign, I was expecting someone to come up and say, Tim, you know nothing about this. You haven't been to Brussels and studied the thing in depth, but 5 unelected presidents, a court that isn't under proper democratic control, and MPs who can't instigate legislation. And that leads you to do very silly things. You always end up with silly policies when you're undemocratic. So they create a currency, the euro, which doesn't have a government to back it. And no currency survived in history without a government backing it up. A currency and a government are two sides of the same coin. But they've gone ahead and created this with economic mayhem resulting not long afterwards in Greece, Portugal, huge unemployment. So those, I think democracy, for all its faults, and when you look around and hear the arguments, you think this can't possibly work, does work really well. And for a common market, friendliness with the European people, we know they're better than us at football, all those things, it's great, but for their sake as well as ours, they need democracy just as much as we do.
Thanks. You would accept, though, that the countries in the EU, in terms of their success, some of the most successful, economically speaking, measures by welfare, inequality, GDP, many of the world's most successful countries are in the European Union.
Well, that's right. I think what's happened is that about a number of years ago, I couldn't put a precise date on it, you got overreach by bureaucracy, which you've had throughout history by people who are given too much power and aren't properly democratically accountable. So most of the time it wasn't a European Union, is my understanding. Most of the time it's been a common market, an economic unit with cooperation at the centre. It's when it started to create a currency which has messed up the economies of a lot of countries, and this concept of an ever closer union, I think that's caused all the problems.
Sure, I think a number of people would certainly share your criticisms of the euro, but it was a significant factor for you, even though the UK has no obligation to join the euro. That was still an important reason for why you wanted to leave.
It was an important reason because, like a lot of the people here, my mortgage doubled when we were in the predecessor of the exchange rate, the euro, the exchange rate mechanism. So then the euro came along, and I couldn't believe that we were going into the successor of something that had failed so badly. But then I agreed with David Cameron 100%. I was right behind him when he said it needed fundamental reform, which I think a lot of people, even if they support Remain, feel it does. But then where it all went wrong was when he said, I got it. I got fundamental reform. So it was only at that point, I'd never said a single word till last March. And at that point, like a lot of people, thought as a relative neutral, this is absurd.
Thanks, and we can maybe come back to David Cameron's sort of failed renegotiation, if you regard it as a failure, later on. Thanks very much, Tim. Kelvin, if I could turn to you now. Obviously, you're a Labour supporter of Leave, which is a minority position within both the party and the parliamentary party. But as I mentioned earlier, you've been a very consistent opponent of Britain's membership of the EEC and then the EU. But many Labour, and some of them have come and spoke at Chatham House during the referendum. I remember Hilary Benn speaking here and saying that he campaigned in 1975 for the UK to leave, but he'd really transitioned away from that position, and many Labour parliamentarians and politicians had, partly to do with the way that the EU has changed and conceptions of a more social Europe that emerged under Delors in the 1980s, but also to do with a vision of a more internationalist Britain, and that the EU became quite central to that idea. What is it that has meant that you weren't able to make that same political journey?
Well, I think the divide is between those of us who take a democratic socialist view and want to re-establish, if you like, the post-war world of full employment, redistribution, of a degree of public ownership of the utilities and public services, and those who have been sucked into the neoliberal consensus, which I think is fundamentally wrong. And the European Union is a subset, I think, of the neoliberal view, building towards globalisation. If you want a clincher, it's their support for TTIP, which was going to give massive power to corporations to prosecute governments if governments dared to interfere with their profit making, and they would be sued for all future profits. It would stop any attempt to take things back into public ownership. But I think my theme, I've spoken many times during the campaign, my theme was that the European Union is anti-democratic, anti-socialist specifically, and failing economically. And this idea that it's doing well, I think, is a mistake. If you take Germany out of the picture, and Germany does well because the euro is really the Deutschmark in disguise, with a lot of weaker currencies bolted onto it inside, which holds down its value, which gives Germany a competitive advantage, particularly against ourselves. If the euro dissolves, and I hope and half expect that it will do, we shall see those currencies adjusting to suitable parities. The Deutschmark will rise rapidly, and if you want an example of what happens, the Swiss, when they broke their link with the euro, it appreciated by 25% over a weekend, because the Swiss currency was being held down by the peg with the euro. That's what will happen to the German Deutschmark. And just recently, there's been an estimate the Greek drachma, if it was recreated, would have to be depreciated by at least 40% to get some sort of sensible parity and give the Greeks a chance to recover. They have been crucified by membership of the euro, and they're terrified of coming out of it because they want to be seen as good Europeans, because they're next door, they've got Turkey, and they don't want to be sunk back into a modern version of the Ottoman Empire or whatever. That's their feeling. But I think socialism is about managing economies on behalf of working people to make sure that everyone has a fair life under an economy. And economies can be managed extremely well, as they were between 1945 and the 1970s, when we suddenly reinvented the economics of the 19th century, went for free markets and so on, and we saw instability, lower growth, and rising unemployment in many of the developed world. And it's now, the crisis of 2008 was one result, but we're now seeing a resistance to that, even amongst people of the right. So that my argument has always been about economics and about the interests of working class people, which is what socialism is about. And I think we can prosper extremely well outside the EU already, because of the depreciation of sterling following the referendum. We've seen exports taking off, significant increase in exports. We're starting to rebuild manufacturing. We've got to be able to use the tools of state aids and public procurement programs and so on to rebuild British manufacturing. We have a gigantic trade deficit, an absolutely extraordinary trade deficit with the rest of the European Union, primarily with Germany, because we have been relatively overvalued, or the euro has been undervalued. That is starting to change. And interestingly, we've now seen the big motor manufacturers deciding to invest in Britain as a result, following the referendum, in spite of the fear that was instilled in us all before, that it would be a disaster and everybody would walk away. That's not actually happened. But I'm an unapologetic Keynesian. I do believe in the arrangements that were established at Bretton Woods in 1944, the beverage and the welfare state, managed economies with significant sectors in public ownership, so that the government's got something to work with, and of course the public utilities worked extremely well. So that's where I stand. I'm a Keynesian democratic socialist, believes in full employment, and the rising living standards that welfare states and the council housing, the redistributive taxation which occurred after the war, when working people saw their lives transformed at a rate which was completely unprecedented. We've seen nothing like it in history. Between 1945 and the 1970s, and I remember it because I'm that old, that the living standards of working class people rose dramatically. And since then we've seen it becoming more unstable, and inequality growing again. When I was young, we didn't have food banks, we didn't have people sleeping in the streets, and we didn't have even the level of unemployment now, which is 1.5 million. It was 500,000 or less. So I stand with Hugh Gateskill, Peter Shaw, Tony Benn. We were against the common market then, and I'm against it now, because I think it's profoundly mistaken. And I look forward to a world where the other European countries who are inside the EU decide to re-establish their own democracies and their own currencies, and work together in a friendly, cooperative way, as we did after the Second World War, but not in a way where we're crucifying each other's economies to benefit one major economy in particular. So when it comes to immigration, I have to say that I represent a multiracial constituency, very multiracial, and every week we hear of people being forcibly deported from Britain back to the Commonwealth countries. I want to see immigration, the same rules for everyone, whatever those might be. And I think a fair immigration system where everybody is treated the same. And before we had free movement, people came to work in Britain, that was fine. And people certainly looking at vegetables in Lincolnshire and so on. People came from Europe and went back and sent remissions home. But free movement is seeing massive increase in population. We're now the most densely populated country in Europe. We didn't used to be. And I do think that is eventually destabilising. British people are basically decent. They want to be friendly with their neighbours. We saw black and Asian people coming to Britain over the summer, which is remarkable how well we've coped with large-scale immigration in the past. There was a labour shortage, and we're actually now all good friends. I mean, a smaller number of people are racist. But actually, if you start to have very large population movements, that sort of friendliness can start to disappear, and I worry about that.
Thank you, Kelvin. Just to press you a little bit on that, you've obviously, that's a a strong socialist critique of how the EU works. Do you accept the criticism that Brexit has not led to a position where the left is politically stronger than it was pre-Brexit? And were you comfortable with some of the political alliances which you were associated with by being in favour of leave, many of who have diametrically opposed positions on most of the issues that you've just referred to?
Yeah. Well, we're all in favour of democracy and governing ourselves, but we cannot achieve what my vision of democratic socialism inside the EU. We have a chance. It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for democratic socialism to be independent and self-governing, and to have our system of first past the post, which gives people a genuine choice between alternative governments, unlike proportional representation, which is carefully designed to guarantee we have centre governments all the time. If we had PR in Britain, we'd have pro-EU, Liberal centre with Nick Clegg as permanent Prime Minister. That, if you want that, that's what would happen.
It's quite a vision. I suspect you voted... Sounds like you voted no to the AV referendum too.
I did indeed, yes. Straight
run of no's. Gerard Batten, turning to you. From UKIP's perspective, and I read in your bio that you were one of the founding members of UKIP. This must be the sort of realisation of a long-held political ambition. Is this the vision that you've seen as the Prime Minister's laid it out, of leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, a free trade agreement with the EU, the end of freedom of movement? Have you got everything that you wanted?
Well, I actually voted Labour in 1974 precisely because Harold Wilson offered us the referendum, and I voted to leave then. What's happening now, and when we've seen Mrs May's white paper, reminds me of the old joke of the chap who's lost in Norfolk driving around the country lanes, and he's going around in circles. In the end, he sees an old farmer walking up the lane, and he says, "Excuse me," he says, "can you tell me the way to Norwich?" And I won't do the accent, but he says, "Well, boy," he says, "if I was you, I wouldn't start from here." And this is where we are with what's happening now, because we are going about it in completely the wrong way. Now, we had the referendum, as we all know, on 23rd of June. There was no equivocation, no qualification. There was nothing in the referendum that said, oh, we have to vote on a deal. David Cameron spent a great deal of public money, nearly £10 million, on a leaflet that went to every household saying that this is a once-in-a-lifetime vote. If you vote, we are leaving and we're going to implement your decision. And of course, a lot of people in the referendum campaign said, oh, what will it be like outside of the European Union? Well, the answer to that is very simple. It'll be like every other country in the world that isn't in the European Union. So where are we now after 9 months of nothing happening? Well, David Cameron could have written the letter to trigger Article 50 10 minutes after the referendum vote was declared. Mrs May could have done it as soon as she was elected Prime Minister, but she didn't do it. And where are we? What do they propose? Well, first of all, let me say that politics, being involved in politics, has made me naturally suspicious, I'm sorry to say. But Mrs May was a Remainer. Had Remain won, she would now be telling us it was the best thing for us and everything was going to be wonderful and we'd tweak and reform the EU and we shouldn't worry ourselves about it anymore. She's now in charge of the leaving process, which is the most historic thing that we've done or are going to do since the end of the Second World War. And where are we? What does she propose? First of all, she's done nothing for 9 months. Now she intends to negotiate for the next 2 years with a body that does not want to negotiate with us and has no incentive whatsoever to reach a deal with us, because why would it? Because all it will do will really encourage the others who might actually be thinking about leaving and their general populations who do not want to see a positive outcome for Britain. Or sorry, they may want to see a positive outcome for Britain, but the European Union doesn't. And you've seen what Mr Juncker has been saying, what Mr Verhofstadt has been saying, what Mr Tusk has been saying, that basically they're not going to make it very easy for us. And if you were on their side of the argument, why indeed would you? Now, this is what should have happened and what the Parliament should have done. Parliament should have immediately passed a bill to repeal the 1972 European Communities Act, because that makes us members of the EU under our law. We would no longer be legally members under our law, but every piece of EU legislation would remain in place because it's all been made acts of Parliament or regulations under statutory instruments. So the government could then go to the European Union and say, on day 2 after we leave, nothing actually happens. And a draft bill has actually been drafted by Sir William Cash that explains exactly how that can happen. It saves me the trouble of having to try to do it myself. I'm very grateful to him. Everything stays in place, but then our government could take emergency action on the things that need emergency action. For example, on trade, a lot of debate about trade. We can make them an offer in an afternoon, which I believe they couldn't refuse, which would be, we want continued tariff-free trade. It's in your interest to have tariff-free trade. It is perfectly legal under World Trade Organization rules for us to continue having that with you, but you can have 3 of your 4 freedoms, goods, services, capital, but you can't have freedom of movement of people. Would you like that or not? If they say no, Mrs. Merkel and whoever's going to be the president of France has to tell the German car manufacturers and the French wine growers why they are going to force Britain to put the common external tariff up when we don't want to. I don't think they want to do that. I think that's an offer they can't refuse. We could then take action on things like immigration, the common fisheries policy, common agricultural policy, security and defence. And then we prioritise. One area I can agree with my opponents in the European Union is they say that will take years to negotiate all this, years and years, 10 years. No, it won't take 10 years, it will take 30 or 40 or 50 years to negotiate your way out of every piece of 172,000 pieces of legislation which the EU website says is actually in place at the moment. What we need to do is to actually say a lot of that stuff is technical. It's about the size of wine glasses and beer glasses and brake lights on farm vehicles. We'll park all that. We may never need to look at that because it's all technical. What we'll do is prioritise what we need to do, and we'll tell you what we're going to do. And I believe in a spirit of friendship and cooperation, they will say, well, Britain's gone, so we might as well agree with them because we've lost them. At the moment, they have no incentive. They have every incentive to delay and impede and hope that some government gets elected in 2 or 3 years' time that will actually reverse the decision of the referendum. That's how they think. That's what they're going to try and do. How do we, now I'll quickly sum up, but you said, I think the tenor of this is what can the Remainers do, the Leavers do to make sure they get the result? Well, from my point of view and a purely partisan point of view, we have to keep the political pressure up. UKIP delivered the referendum because of 20 years of electoral threat. Our troops were out on the ground and got the result, and now we have to keep that pressure up to make sure that the government doesn't renege on the result. And although we don't want the Article 50 route, we have issued 6 tests this week which we will use to monitor what the government's doing and explain how it should be done. If I can just finish by saying there are 2 big crises facing the European Union which have been touched on, which may actually mean that the European Union comes apart before we leave. Number 1 is the European single currency, which for all the reasons described here was a disaster and is a disaster because it was a purely political project, not an economic one. And the reason it kept coming back after the snake and the European exchange rate mechanism, as Tim said, was precisely because it was something that a unified political state has to have. It has to have a central bank and a currency, and it doesn't matter what the cost is to ordinary people. And I think it was Nigel Spearing, who was an anti-common market MP a very long time ago that I had the pleasure of meeting back in '92, who said, if we go ahead with joining the EU, or the EEC as it was then, what we'll end up with is government by bankers. And what have we got? Government by bankers. The second crisis that's going to hit the EU is when they realise that we are leaving and we are taking away our contribution to the budget. They'll suddenly realise there's a hole to fill. And most of these countries in the EU, the majority of countries in the EU, have never made a positive contribution to the budget, a net contribution. They are net beneficiaries. And when they suddenly start to realise that they've got to pay to be a member of this club rather than be paid to be a member of it, that's when they're going to have second thoughts about their membership. But I have no view on the EU, whether it survives or not, that's its business. What I want is, just like Kelvin has described, to live in a democratic country that makes its own laws. And God help me, that even means if Jeremy Corbyn ends up as Prime Minister.
I love Jeremy.
So, yeah, like I said, complete agreement with the government's approach. There's lots of many different issues that we could discuss then. Just two quick points. One on the timing of Article 50, and I remember this was also the position of Jeremy Corbyn on the day after the referendum, which is pretty heavily criticised by some people, that his proposal was that the government should trigger Article 50 straight away. Do you believe that the British government was prepared to handle the consequences of leaving the EU on the 24th of June in the way you've implied then?
Well, they could have read the book that I wrote 2 years ago, which explained how it was. I did send a copy to all of the supposed Eurosceptic MPs.
Assuming Mr Cameron hadn't read your book.
Well, if I can sit and do it on my own, I'm sure the combined wit and wisdom of the government and the civil service could have worked out the priorities that they need to put in place very quickly, if they'd have wanted to.
And you would have supported that too, Kelvin?
Yeah, I think the difficulties of leaving are massively overstated. I think it's fairly straightforward, actually, and we've got all the cards. You know, the fact is we pay a gigantic amount effectively through remissions from people living here, and also the people who live, the British citizens who live there, live most of them on pensions from Britain. So there's a vast outflow of money there as well. They don't want to remove that, I'm sure. They don't want to lose the remissions from the people working here.
That implies, though, that those you want those people to, or you would at least threaten to let those people leave.
No, I want them to stay. You know, one of my best friends from
But
university lives
that
in
doesn't
France.
affect the future relationship. That's the position of people who are already living here, who came here legally under.
Yeah, I mean, you know, people who are living here now should be given the right to stay. I have no problem about that. That's you can't uproot families when they're at school and children, whatever. That would be cruel and unacceptable. But the point I'm making is the vast amount of outflow. If you add up our trade deficit, which is £60 billion a year, plus the remissions deficit and financial flows, another 20 billion, plus our net contribution to the budget, which is 11 billion, we get to a figure of £90 billion a year of British cash going into the EU. Some of it will carry on going to the EU. But we've got to do something about trade in particular. That is the equivalent of £6,000 a year for a family of four, which is an enormous sum of money. I don't think they want to lose most of that. And if they try to play hardball, if you like, I don't think they will. I mean, I think there'll be a deal done and it will be fairly straightforward. I think what's been happening in Parliament, I think, is that the government and the leader of the opposition in particular have been trying to deal with the majority of Remainers. So the great majority of people in Parliament are Remainers, and they've got to deal with it gently so they don't upset them too much. But if they just said it's straightforward, we're going to do this, this and this, I think we wouldn't have a problem. I think they've handled it extremely well, and I think David Davis's introduction to his white paper was very well written, very carefully written, and you know, perfectly acceptable.
And so, just intrigued to know about the other people on the panel. Is your expectation then, based on what you've said, that trade between the UK and the EU would go down in the future? Because this whole argument about the trade deficit ignores the fact that obviously the UK, the share of the UK's trade with the EU is much larger than the EU's share of trade with the UK, regardless of the position of the deficit. So proportionally, we are much more invested in the trade relationship and the consequences of the trade relationship.
But if you buy much more from a country than they buy from you, and you've got a gigantic trade deficit, there is a way of adjusting that. Keynes made arrangements at Bretton Woods for countries to be able to depreciate their currencies or devalue because they were pegged. And he also wanted, I have to say, that Keynes wanted to arrange for countries to be required to revalue if they had big trade surpluses. But the Americans wouldn't wear that because they thought they'd be in the position of having to be revalued.
That process of rebalancing might lead to some economic disruption in the UK. Unemployment or lower investment.
Be the opposite. Our problem would be coping with the extraordinary increase in demand for our products because of the depreciation. If we start to buy British cars instead of German cars, we import 4 German cars for every one we export to it. Now, if that goes to 2-2, so we only export 2 German cars to 1. We've still got to get an extra 2 cars to make up the ones we lost from Germany. So I think actually the motor manufacturers are now investing fairly heavily because they can see an increase in domestic demand for motor vehicles, which will be so.